Welcome to Obscure Minds, a space where the darkest corners of the human psyche are revealed through true stories that were never meant to be told. Here, silence speaks louder than words, and every truth hides a shadow. The winter of 1955 settled over Plainfield, Wisconsin like a burial shroud. Snow fell in thick, deliberate flakes that muffled every sound, turning the world into something that felt more like a memory than reality. In the fading light of November evenings, the barns stood like ancient sentinels against a sky the color of old blood, and the wind carried with it something that made even the bravest souls quicken their pace when darkness fell. It was in this landscape of whispered prayers and locked doors that Margaret Sullivan found herself walking alone down County Road F. Her footsteps the only sound breaking the cathedral silence of the Wisconsin countryside. The year 1955 was supposed to be about healing. America was stitching itself back together after the war, building suburban dreams and nuclear families. But here, in the heart of rural Wisconsin, something older lingered in the spaces between the farmhouses, something that predated hope and prosperity. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you watching this, and what time is it there right now? Margaret had heard the stories, of course. Every woman in Plainfield had heard them. Stories of shadows that moved wrong in the twilight, of footsteps that followed you home from church, of eyes that watched from windows that should have been empty. The men dismissed such talk as hysteria, the natural nervousness of women left too long alone while their husbands worked the fields or traveled to Madison for supplies. But women know things that men refuse to see. Women understand that some hungers cannot be satisfied with bread, and some thirsts cannot be quenched with water. The farmhouse at the end of Archer Avenue had been empty for months, or so everyone believed. The man who lived there, tall, gaunt, with eyes the color of winter ice, kept to himself in ways that made even the most charitable church ladies cross themselves when his name was mentioned. Edward Theodore Gein. Even speaking his name felt like invoking something that should remain sleeping. What if she hadn't run that night? What if the world never knew what waited behind that door? The autumn of 1955 was different from those that came before. Something in the air itself seemed charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the coming winter storms. Veterans returning from Korea spoke of things they had seen in the mountains, of cruelties that defied understanding, but their words seemed almost innocent compared to the silence that emanated from the Gein property. It was a silence that had weight, that pressed against your chest and made breathing feel like swimming through dark water. Plainfield in those days was a town built on the foundation stones of Lutheran certainty and Methodist resolve. Church bells marked the passage of time, and Sunday services were attended with the kind of fervor usually reserved for matters of life and death. Perhaps because in a place like Plainfield they often were. The town existed in that peculiar space that rural America has always occupied, too small for secrets, too isolated for truth. The local newspaper, the Plainfield Sun, printed stories about harvest festivals and church socials, about young men heading off to college and young women preparing for marriages that would bind them to the land for life. But it never printed the stories that mattered. It never mentioned the way Mrs. Henderson's chickens had stopped laying eggs after she reported seeing a figure watching her house from the tree line. It never discussed why the Kowalski family had moved to Milwaukee so suddenly, leaving behind a farm that had been in their family for 3 generations. The sheriff, Arthur Schley, was a man who understood that some truths were too dangerous for daylight. He had served in the Pacific during the war, had seen what human beings were capable of when civilization's thin veneer was stripped away. When he returned to Wisconsin, he brought with him the knowledge that evil was not some abstract theological concept. It was as real as winter frost and just as capable of killing everything it touched. In the weeks leading up to that November night, reports had been filtering in through channels that existed outside official records. Missing persons cases that were never filed, families who simply packed up and left without explanation, livestock found in conditions that suggested something far worse than natural predators. The Wisconsin State Police had issued quiet directives to local law enforcement: maintain order, avoid panic, and under no circumstances allow the press to connect these incidents to any single location or individual. Margaret Sullivan was 23 years old that November, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, working as a secretary at the grain elevator and living in the small apartment above Kowalski's abandoned grocery store. She was the kind of woman who read books that weren't approved by the church library, who asked questions that made men uncomfortable, who walked alone after dark because she refused to live in fear of shadows that might or might not be real. But some shadows are more real than the things that cast them. The night it happened, November 16, 1955, Margaret had been walking home from choir practice at First Lutheran. The evening service had run late. Pastor Hoffman had been particularly fervent in his sermon about the wages of sin, about the darkness that lived in the hearts of men when they turned away from God's light. As Margaret walked through the November darkness, his words seemed to follow her like an echo, mixing with the sound of her heels on the frozen gravel and the distant howling of wind through bare branches. She should have taken Main Street home, should have stayed on the well-lit path that led directly to her apartment. Instead, some impulse she would never fully understand directed her feet toward Archer Avenue, toward the darkness that pooled between the abandoned farms like black water in an empty well. The Gein farmhouse squatted against the night sky like a wound in the world. No lights burned in its windows, no smoke rose from its chimney, yet something about it suggested occupancy more powerfully than any sign of life could have. Margaret found herself drawn toward it with the inexorable pull of gravity, each step carrying her closer to something she didn't understand but couldn't resist. The front porch sagged under the weight of years and neglect. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding like diseased skin, and the windows stared blindly into the night with a darkness that seemed almost solid. Margaret's hand reached for the door handle without conscious direction, her fingers closing around brass that was cold enough to burn. That was when she heard it. Not a voice exactly, not even a sound that could be properly described. It was more like the memory of screaming, an echo of agony that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Margaret's hand froze on the door handle as every instinct she possessed suddenly screamed in unison. Run! The smell hit her then, sweet and metallic, like copper pennies left in the rain, like flowers rotting in a closed room. It seeped through the gaps around the doorframe, carrying with it implications that her conscious mind refused to process, but her body understood with primitive clarity. This was the smell of things that should not be. Margaret's feet carried her backward without her willing them to move. One step, then another. Then she was running across the frozen yard, her heels catching in the rough ground, her breath coming in sharp white puffs that dissipated into the darkness like ghosts. Behind her, the farmhouse watched with its empty windows, and though no light appeared, no door opened, she could feel something stirring in the darkness she had left behind. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, until she reached the safety of Main Street's yellow streetlights and the familiar comfort of Mrs. Peterson's lighted kitchen window. Only then did she stop, pressing her back against the rough bark of an oak tree, trying to understand what had just happened to her. The next morning, Margaret called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Schley listened to her story with the kind of patience usually reserved for children reporting monsters under their beds, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the courthouse square where early shoppers were beginning their Saturday errands. "Miss Sullivan," he said finally, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Sometimes the mind plays tricks on us, especially when we're alone at night. The imagination can make us see things, hear things, smell things that aren't really there. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Happens to the best of us." But Margaret caught something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that suggested he knew more than he was willing to say. When she pressed him for details, asked if there had been other reports, other incidents, his face closed like a door slamming shut. My advice, Sheriff Schley continued, is to forget about last night. Don't go walking alone after dark, stick to well-traveled roads, and don't go looking for trouble that might not even exist. Transcript. Sheriff's Log, November 17, 1955. Female subject claims she experienced unusual phenomena at the Gein property. Advised standard protocol. No follow-up required. Subject demonstrated signs of nervous exhaustion. Recommend she avoid the area in question. End of record. What Margaret didn't know. What she wouldn't learn until years later. When the truth finally crawled out of its hiding place and into the harsh light of public scrutiny, was that she was not the first person to report strange occurrences around the Gein farm. The sheriff's files contained dozens of similar reports, dating back months and even years. Missing pets, strange lights, sounds that carried across the fields on windless nights, women who reported feeling watched, followed, hunted. Mrs. Eleanor Hodge had filed a report in September about finding mutilated animals on her property, arranged in patterns that suggested human intervention. The report was filed under Wildlife Management and forgotten. Tommy Kowalski, age 16, had told his parents about seeing a figure digging in the Gein family cemetery at midnight, but his story was dismissed as the overactive imagination of a boy who read too many horror comics. The pattern was always the same: report, dismiss, forget. The official machinery of small-town law enforcement was designed to maintain peace, not to uncover truths that might shatter the comfortable illusions that allowed people to sleep at night. Memo: Wisconsin State Police, November 1955. Incidents in Plainfield vicinity. Local authorities advised to minimize documentation. Public safety requires discretion. Any media inquiries to be referred to state level immediately. But some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave. 3 weeks after Margaret's encounter, on the night of December 8, 1955, Bernice Worden disappeared from her hardware store in downtown Plainfield. The disappearance would eventually lead investigators to the Gein farmhouse, where they would discover horrors that would redefine America's understanding of human evil. The official story focuses on what they found that day: the lampshades made of human skin, the furniture upholstered with human flesh, the carefully preserved collection of female body parts arranged like trophies in rooms that reeked of death and madness. The official story does not mention Margaret Sullivan. It does not discuss the reports that preceded the discovery, the warnings that went unheeded, the women who tried to tell the truth only to be dismissed as hysterical or delusional. The official story is concerned with facts, with evidence that can be photographed and cataloged and presented in courtrooms. But the real story, the story that matters, is about the silence that allowed such horrors to flourish. It's about a community that chose blindness over sight, comfort over truth, order over justice. It's about the women who knew, who sensed, who tried to warn, only to be told that their fears were unfounded, their instincts untrustworthy, their voices insignificant. Margaret Sullivan spent the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she had opened that door. In her nightmares, and she had many until the day she died in 1987, she imagined herself stepping across the threshold, imagined what she might have seen in those rooms where Ed Gein pursued his grotesque work. Sometimes she dreamed that she had saved someone, that her intrusion had interrupted some act of unspeakable cruelty. Other times she dreamed that she had become another trophy, another piece of furniture in the madman's collection. But in her waking hours, she understood the truth that the nightmares obscured. She had been allowed to escape. Something in that house had let her go. Whether it was Ed Gein himself, watching from a darkened window as she approached his door, or some deeper intelligence that operated according to rules she could never understand, she had been permitted to walk away from certain death. The question that haunted her was why. The psychological profile of Ed Gein, compiled years after his arrest, painted a picture of a man driven by compulsion so powerful that they overrode every human instinct toward connection and compassion. He was described as a loner, a misfit, a victim of childhood abuse who had turned his trauma outward onto the world. But Margaret Sullivan knew something that the psychologists and criminologists would never include in their reports. Ed Gein was not simply crazy. He was something far more dangerous than madness. He was methodical. The arrangement of items in his house, the careful preservation of human remains, the ritualistic nature of his activities, all of it spoke to a mind that operated according to its own twisted logic. This was not the random violence of a broken psyche. It was the deliberate work of someone who believed deeply in what he was doing. And if Ed Gein believed in what he was doing, then he was part of something larger, something that connected him to forces and purposes that existed beyond the boundaries of individual psychology. Margaret began to research, quietly and carefully, the history of the land where the Gein farmhouse stood. What she discovered made her understand why she had been spared that November night. The property had a history that stretched back to before European settlement, back to the indigenous peoples who had avoided that particular stretch of ground for reasons their oral traditions preserved in fragments and whispers. The Menominee had stories about places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where spirits could cross over from the realm of the dead to trouble the living. They had marked such places with warnings, had built their villages and hunting camps elsewhere, had passed down through generations the knowledge of which ground was safe and which was not. White settlers, in their infinite arrogance, had ignored such warnings as primitive superstition. They had built their farms and their families on cursed ground, and then had wondered why their children sickened, why their crops failed, why their sleep was troubled by dreams of things that should not be. Ed Gein had grown up on such ground, had breathed its air, drunk its water, absorbed its influence through every pore of his developing consciousness. By the time he reached adulthood, he was no longer entirely human. He had become something else, something that served purposes older than civilization and hungrier than madness. Margaret realized that her escape had nothing to do with luck or divine intervention. She had been spared because she was not what the thing that lived in Ed Gein's body was looking for. She was too old, perhaps, or the wrong physical type, or simply not sufficiently vulnerable to whatever criteria governed its selection process. She had approached the threshold of hell and been found wanting, a rejection that felt both like salvation and like the deepest kind of insult. The women who did not escape, Bernice Worden, Mary Hogan, and the others whose names were never recorded, because their disappearances were never officially investigated, they had possessed some quality that Margaret lacked, some vulnerability, some innocence, some spark that fed the hunger that drove Ed Gein's terrible work. Or perhaps the truth was simpler and more disturbing. Perhaps Margaret had been allowed to live because she was meant to be a witness. Perhaps her survival was itself part of the design, part of a plan that required someone to remember, someone to carry the story forward, someone to ensure that the truth would eventually find its way into the light. In 1957, when Ed Gein was finally arrested and the contents of his farmhouse were revealed to a horrified world, Margaret Sullivan watched the news coverage with a mixture of vindication and terror. She had been right about what waited in that house, but being right brought no comfort. If anything, it made everything worse because now she knew that her instincts had been accurate, that the danger she had sensed was real, and that somewhere out there other houses sheltered other secrets, other horrors waited behind other doors. The trial that followed was a media sensation, one of the first true crime spectacles of the television age. Ed Gein was found guilty but criminally insane, sentenced to life in a mental institution rather than execution. The decision sparked outrage among those who believed that some crimes were so heinous that madness was no excuse, but it also reflected a growing understanding that Gein represented something new in the American experience, a type of killer that existing categories could not adequately contain. Margaret followed the trial coverage obsessively, searching for some acknowledgement of the broader pattern, some recognition that Gein's crimes were part of something larger than individual pathology. But the focus remained narrow, clinical, safe. The newspapers wrote about childhood trauma and social isolation, about the failure of mental health systems and the need for better law enforcement protocols. They did not write about cursed ground or ancient hungers or the thin places where darkness leaked through into the ordinary world. The Gein farmhouse was eventually demolished, the grounds salted and left fallow. Official records stated that the destruction was necessary to prevent the site from becoming a macabre tourist attraction, but Margaret suspected deeper motives. Some places are too dangerous to preserve, too contaminated by what has occurred there to allow continued existence. The authorities understood, perhaps better than they were willing to admit publicly, that some evils can survive the death of those who serve them. But evil is patient, and evil is persistent, and evil always finds new servants when the old ones are no longer useful. In the years that followed Ed Gein's imprisonment, Margaret began to notice patterns in the news that others seemed to miss. Disappearances in rural areas that were never adequately investigated. Crimes that shared certain ritualistic elements with what had been found in the Gein house. Stories that were reported briefly and then forgotten, buried under the weight of official indifference and public willingness to believe that monsters were rare aberrations rather than symptoms of something systemic. She began to keep files, clipping newspapers and collecting reports, mapping connections that law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't see. What emerged was a picture of a network, not of conscious collaboration, but of shared influence, of multiple individuals responding to the same dark impulses, serving the same ancient purposes without necessarily being aware of their connection to each other. The pattern was always the same: isolated locations, vulnerable victims, ritualistic elements that suggested purposes beyond simple violence or sexual gratification. And always, somewhere in the background, there were witnesses who had tried to warn, who had sensed the danger, who had been dismissed or ignored until it was too late. Margaret realized that she had become part of this pattern, that her survival was not an ending but a beginning. She had been chosen not as a victim but as a chronicler, someone whose job was to remember, to document, to ensure that the truth survived even when official records were destroyed or suppressed. It was a terrible burden, the weight of knowledge that no one wanted to hear. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. Her attempts to share what she had learned met with skepticism at best and hostility at worst. People preferred their monsters safely contained within the boundaries of individual pathology, their evil explicable through the comfortable categories of psychology and sociology. The idea that something deeper and more persistent might be at work, something that transcended individual cases and connected seemingly unrelated crimes across vast distances of time and space, was too disturbing to contemplate. It suggested that the comfortable illusions of safety and progress that defined post-war American life were just that, illusions, and that the darkness humanity thought it had left behind in the primitive past was still very much present, still very much active, still very much hungry. As Margaret grew older, she began to understand that her true purpose was not to solve the mystery, but to preserve it. The truth she carried was too dangerous to share widely, too powerful to be released without careful consideration of the consequences. Knowledge could be a weapon, but it could also be a poison, and some truths were toxic enough to destroy those who came into contact with them unprepared. She began to write, carefully and secretly, recording everything she had learned about Ed Gein and the forces that had shaped him. But she wrote not for immediate publication but for some future generation that might be better equipped to handle such knowledge, that might possess the wisdom to use it constructively rather than destructively. The manuscript grew over the years, becoming a comprehensive account of her research into the deeper patterns of American violence. She documented the connections she had discovered, the recurring elements that linked seemingly isolated crimes, the geographical and temporal clusters that suggested coordinated activity by forces that operated according to principles unknown to conventional law enforcement. But even as she wrote, Margaret understood that the most important part of her story was not what she had discovered, but what she had experienced. The moment on Ed Gein's porch when she had looked into the face of absolute evil and somehow found the strength to turn away. The knowledge that survival sometimes required not courage but surrender, not fighting but fleeing, not standing your ground but recognizing when the ground itself was poisoned. That November night in 1955 had taught her something that no amount of research could have conveyed: that evil was real, that it was patient, that it was far more intelligent than anyone wanted to believe, and that it was always watching, always waiting, always ready to exploit the moment when human vigilance faltered. Margaret Sullivan died in 1987, taking most of her secrets with her to the grave. Her manuscript was discovered among her effects, but it was never published. The executor of her estate, following instructions she had left, donated the papers to a private research foundation that specialized in unusual historical documents. The foundation's archives are not open to the public, and their contents are restricted to qualified researchers who can demonstrate both academic credentials and psychological stability sufficient to handle disturbing material. But before she died, Margaret made one final addition to her manuscript, a warning addressed to anyone who might eventually read her work. She wrote, "The story I have told you is true, but truth is not always safe. If you have read this far, you already know more than you should. Be careful what you do with this knowledge. Be careful who you share it with. And be very, very careful not to go looking for proof that what I have described is real. Some doors should never be opened. Some truths should never be spoken aloud. Some names should never be called in the darkness. If you find yourself walking alone at night, and you come to a place that feels wrong, that smells of copper and roses, that whispers promises you cannot quite understand, turn around. Walk away. Do not look back. Do not wonder what might have been. Do not regret the mystery left unsolved. Some escapes are miracles, some survivals are gifts, and some stories, once heard, can never be forgotten." The farmhouse is gone now, demolished and forgotten. The official records have been sealed or destroyed. The witnesses have died, taking their memories with them into whatever darkness waits beyond life. But the ground remembers. The air remembers. And somewhere in the spaces between what is known and what can be proven, the truth waits like a patient predator, ready to reveal itself to the next person brave enough or foolish enough to go looking for it. Was Ed Gein simply a madman whose crimes happened to resonate with ancient fears and primitive superstitions? Or was he something more dangerous? A servant of forces that exist outside the comfortable boundaries of rational explanation, a conduit for hungers that have stalked humanity since the beginning of time. The answer depends on how much truth you can handle, how much reality you can accept, how willing you are to acknowledge that the world might be far stranger and far more dangerous than you have been led to believe. Margaret Sullivan opened a door that night in 1955. Not with her hand, but with her mind. She glimpsed something that was never meant to be seen, learned something that was never meant to be known, and spent the rest of her life carrying the weight of knowledge that no one else wanted to bear. The question is not whether she was telling the truth about what happened that November night. The question is whether you are prepared to live in a world where such truths are possible. Was it madness or design? If you enjoy watching documentaries and real stories based on true events, stay with us and follow this channel. We're truly grateful to have you here. Some stories were never meant to be told, but now that you've heard it, there's no way to unhear it.